Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the last session of our Spring Break Survivor Speaker Series. Happy to have you with us today. I wanted to start by thanking our community partners for this series: Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, and the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. We appreciate your ongoing support of the museum and our programs. We do encourage you all to ask questions during today's program. If you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button for me, it should be at the bottom of your screen if you are on a computer, and it might be toward the top if you are on a tablet or mobile device. We are thrilled to have with us today second generation speaker Ron Schwartz, who will tell his father's story. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ron.
Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Annie. Thank you for attending today. As Annie told you, my name is Ron Schwartz, and I am going to be telling you a story today. This is a true story. It's my father's story and my grandparents. For my dad, it's about what it was like for him growing up as a Jew in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And for my grandparents, what it was like for them enduring the Nazis in the 1920s and 30s. Let's see, there we go. Sorry, I got to share my screen. Wait, hang on a second. Got to do that again. Okay. I hope you all can see that. So for me, the story begins in Ludwigshafen, Germany in 1925. The Ludwigshafen is about 60 miles south of Frankfurt, which is the biggest city in Germany. And during the 1920s, Ludwigshafen's actually kind of a bit of a booming town. It's growing a lot. There's a lot of industry there. A lot of young people are moving there. There's a Jewish population in Ludwigshafen at the time of about 1,400. Not huge, but big enough to have a synagogue. And if you look at these pictures, this picture on the top left, that is the synagogue in Ludwigshafen in the 1920s, and the top right is the inside of the synagogue. My grandparents got married in 1925. My grandmother married a man named Carl Sidlin. Carl Sidlin was a watchmaker, and he owned a watchmaker shop on a street called Prinz-Regentenstrasse. And this is a picture of the street from the 1920s. And if you see this little clock on the right, this is actually where his watchmaker shop was located. And they lived right across the street in an apartment building over here. I believe this was number 65 and the shop was number 68. They got married in 1925. 10 months later, at the beginning of 1926, my father was born. A week after my father was born, with my grandmother still in the hospital in the maternity ward, one of my grandfather's ex-employees walked into the store. He was not working. He used to work there. He wasn't working there any longer. And he walked into the store to talk to my grandfather about coming back to work. They came to an agreement that he would start the next Monday. And after they came to an agreement, the guy took out a gun and shot my grandfather in the chest, killing him. He shot two other employees in the store, but those were just superficial wounds. And then he turned the gun on himself and he killed himself. This is what you're looking at on the screen. This is an article, the article from the newspaper about the shootings, about the murders. And this headline, which is exploded out, says, "A terrible bloody act, 2 dead and 2 injured on Prinz-Regentenstrasse." I think Carl Sidlin was a pretty well-known and popular guy in town. The newspaper article talked about the funeral and talked about hundreds of people uh, in the streets following the coffin to the cemetery. Now, imagine my poor grandmother. She's 24, 25 years old, really just a kid. Her husband was just murdered uh, after, what, 10 months of marriage. And she's got a newborn son who's 8 days old. And now she's got a jewelry store to run. But life goes on. 3 years later, in 1929, my grandmother remarried. She married a man named Oscar Schwartz. That's why I am a Schwartz. And Oscar adopted my father and took over the jewelry store. This is actually an address book from Ludwigshafen. They had phone books, and then they also published address books where you could look up name and just, again, see addresses of people. So this is the Schwartz section, and you can see down here Oscar. And I know this writing is a little hard to read, but it says Prinz Regentenstrasse, and it's number 65, and that's where they lived. Things were actually okay in the 1920s. So this is now the late 20s. Things are, like I said, things are okay. Ludwigshafen's growing, there's industry, and things were good really until they weren't. Let's listen to my father talk about going to school and some of the anti-Semitism there.
In the, I don't know about the first year, but certainly in the second, third year, and beyond that, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the school. In other words, the kids called me Saujude, which is German for Jew pig. And I remember that the teacher really didn't take any action. I mean, he was not openly antagonistic towards me, but he certainly made no attempt whatsoever to curb the other children.
So that's my dad. He's a cute little nugget, isn't he? I have about 5 hours of video testimony of my father, of just really his whole story and growing up and everything he remembers. And so you're going to see, we've excerpted some clips from those 5 hours of video, and you're going to hear some more from my father later on. Anyway, so what's interesting about what he just said was even before Hitler came to power, there was anti-Semitism in Germany and feelings of antagonism towards the Jews in Germany. In 1933, Hitler comes to power. He is named chancellor. He quickly consolidates power and assumes a dictatorial role in Germany. I think it's really important to point out that Hitler came to power completely legally and lawfully. There was no military takeover. There was no coup d'etat. Again, purely by legal means. How did a guy like Hitler be able to take over? Well, I told you things were going pretty well in Germany in the 1920s, and they were. Germany was really recovering from World War I until the Depression in the United States in 1929. The US has this depression. The US had lent Germany a lot of money to rebuild after World War I. When the Depression hit, the US was in dire straits. They wanted their money back, and they made demands on Germany to pay them back, and Germany didn't have the money. So they just started printing money so they could pay back the US. This threw Germany into economic freefall. The currency devalued. I think at one point the Reichsmark, which was the German currency at the time, was something like 3 billion to $1. inflation was rampant. Prices in restaurants were increasing while you were sitting there eating a meal, and unemployment was rampant. Hitler's appeal came from two things that he was saying. Hitler said, I'm going to end this unemployment. I'm going to give everybody a job. And I'm going to do this by rebuilding the military infrastructure in Germany. And the other thing that he said is, and the reason you don't have a job and you don't have money is because of the Jews. The Jews are the ones with the jobs and the money, and they're controlling it. So he blamed the Jews. They were the scapegoat, and that really had a lot of appeal in Germany. So Hitler's in power now. It's 1933. 2 years later, Germany introduces and passes the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were for the protection of German blood and honor. And they imposed all kinds of restrictions on the Jews, both socially and economically. For example, it stripped German citizenship from the Jews. So even if you were born in Germany and raised in Germany, if you were Jewish, you were no longer German. You didn't have a German passport. You were stateless. You were not a German citizen anymore. Jews were no longer allowed to use municipal hospitals. Jewish officers were expelled from the army. Jewish businesses had to paint yellow stars on their shop windows. You can see an example of that here in this photograph. The list goes on. Non-Jewish women couldn't work like as housekeepers in Jewish homes. There was no intermarrying. Jews couldn't marry Germans. So there's a whole long list of things that that Jews couldn't do. Again, it really restricted their life. And this is the front page of the New York Times from 1935 after the Nuremberg laws were passed. And you can see here's a story about the Nuremberg laws. And I put this in here only because I think it's important to note that there was this is the New York Times, which means this was happening in Germany, but there was international knowledge about what was happening. Let's listen to my father now talk about the Nuremberg laws and some of the restrictions that he remembers.
In the meantime, additional decrees came out limiting the movement of Jews. For instance, I recall we couldn't go anymore to the park where we used to go because the benches in the park had signs, no Jews are allowed. It was difficult to travel because hotels had signs, no dogs and no Jews. As a side comment, after World War II, the Germans liked to go to the shore in Holland, and since the Dutch had suffered quite a bit under the German occupation, the hotels on the shore in Holland had signs, no dogs and no Germans.
You could hear my father chuckle there. He kind of loved that story. He used to tell me that story when I was a kid growing up, and then he would laugh. I think what's important to note from what my father said about the restrictions, you might say he started out and he talked about additional decrees were coming all the time. In all, the Nazis passed something like 400 laws and decrees restricting Jewish life in Germany. And that was just at the federal level. In addition to those 400 decrees, the local municipalities passed their own decrees in addition to that. So, I mean, they just legislated the Jews to death. 3 years later, in 1938, Kristallnacht happened. Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass. And what happened was that German citizens, private citizens, and paramilitary groups vandalized Jewish homes and businesses. They went to businesses, they broke the shop windows, they broke into them, they destroyed the merchandise, they destroyed the stores. They went to Jewish homes and apartments, and this is throughout the country. They went to homes and apartments, they broke down the doors, they destroyed the furniture, they wreaked havoc on Jews and violence against Jews across the country. They also, they burned down all of the synagogues in Germany. And that synagogue that I showed you in one of those first slides, here you see that same synagogue and you can see the smoke coming out of it. So there were no more synagogues left in Germany after Kristallnacht. About 30,000 Jews were arrested that night. They were sent to Dachau. This picture on the top right is from Dachau at Kristallnacht, showing people arrested and sort of lined up to be, processed to go into Dachau. My grandfather was Oscar Schwartz, was one of the people that was arrested. My father's going to talk a little bit more about that. And again, here's the front page of the Dallas Morning News from November 1938. Hysterical Nazis wreck thousands of Jewish shops, burn synagogues in wild orgy of looting and terror. Again, this is happening in Germany, but there's international knowledge that this is happening in Germany. Okay, let's listen to my father talk about Kristallnacht.
We were spared. They never came to our apartment, nor did they destroy the store. And they told my parents later on that since we had a jewelry store and there was a lot of gold in there, that they considered that to be state property, and therefore it was not their intention of destroying it. They picked up my dad, and for several days we didn't really know where he had been sent to. My mother went to the Gestapo office every day to find out what the status was, and I gather they were civil to her, and she finally found out that he had been sent to Dachau.
So my grandfather spent 5 to 6 weeks imprisoned at Dachau, and then he was released. You might wonder about that, released from Dachau. Who gets released from concentration camps? Well, in the late 30s, the concentration camps were not yet what they became later on during the war. At this point in time, the concentration camps were they functioned as prisons for people who were undesirable to the Nazis, people like Jews, homosexuals, and gypsies. So it was not uncommon in the late 30s to be sent to a prison like that, like Dachau, and then get released.
We were spared.
In the middle of 1938, the Nazis passed one of the decrees, one of the laws they passed. It was a name change requirement. It was called the Law on Alteration of Family and Personal Names. And what that meant, what they had to do was, if you were Jewish, you had to add a name to your name. So for example, all men had to adopt the name Israel. So my father, who was Oscar Schwartz, was now Oscar Israel Schwartz. And all women had to adopt the name Sarah. So my grandmother, who was Therese Schwartz, was now known as Therese Sarah Schwartz. And in fact, what the Nazis did, this document in the middle, this is my grandparents' marriage certificate. And you notice these notations on the right side. Well, those notations are not part of the original marriage certificate. They were added later by the Nazis. The Nazis came through, they went through the civil register, they pulled all the marriage certificates. And what this top block, what it says over here, I don't know if you can read it, it says that Oscar Schwartz is now known as, has added the name Israel to his name. And this bottom block says that Therese Schwartz has now added the name Sarah to her name. Why did the Nazis do this? Well, I think there were two reasons. First of all, there's a bit of humiliation involved. If you, I mean, your name is your identity. And if everybody has the same name, your uniqueness is gone. You are the same as everybody else. So I think there was a humiliation factor involved. And also it identified people as being Jewish. You knew if you ran into someone named Israel or Sarah, it was really clear that, that they were Jews. Right after Kristallnacht, well, a couple months actually, after Kristallnacht, my grandfather gets this letter. It's from the equivalent of the mayor's office in Ludwigshafen. And the subject line, which is broken out here, says, elimination of Jews from German economic life. Okay, so this was another decree that Jews were now not permitted to engage in economic activities. And this letter ordered him to liquidate the store and shut down his jewelry store, his watchmaker shop. First of all, I want you to notice that the letter is addressed to Oscar Israel Schwartz, okay? Anyway, it orders my grandfather, the letter orders my grandfather to do an inventory of all the merchandise, list every item along with its value. My grandfather did that. It was a 15-page inventory. I have a copy of the inventory that he did. And he came up with a value for the inventory of approximately 10,000 Reichsmarks. And he submitted it. And by the way, he signed the inventory, Oscar Israel Schwartz. I cannot imagine what that was like for him to have to use the name Israel. Well, of course, the Nazis aren't going to believe the Jews, so they brought in their own appraiser to appraise the inventory. And that appraiser wrote this letter. This was the guy, Richard Albrecht, and he wrote a letter saying that he didn't agree with my grandfather's valuation, that he thought the value was 6,500 Reichsmarks. He signed the letter down at the bottom, Heil Hitler, with his name. And I want to tell you, I've been through literally thousands of pages of documents. I've been through archives in Germany and France and Switzerland. Nothing affected me the way this did, actually seeing this Heil Hitler. And of course he would sign the letter that way. The guy was a Nazi, but this just took something that you kind of knew was true and knew was happening. And it just made it really real for me. It really resonated with me. Anyway, my grandfather was able to find a buyer for the jewelry store. He and the buyer agreed on a price of 7,500 Reichsmarks, which was somewhere in the middle. They had a contract to sell the store. I have a copy of the contract to sell the store. And in the contract, it says that the price is to be paid immediately after approval by the trade office. Okay, the Nazis have to approve the sale. And on the blocked account of the German state bank in Ludwigshafen. Well, what does that mean on the blocked account? What that means is this buyer paid the money. He paid the 7,500 Reichsmarks, but it went into an account that was blocked. So my grandfather never got the money. The Nazis stole the money. And this was actually pretty typical. A lot of businesses that were sold or seized from Jews in Germany, the Jewish owners never saw the money. So quite honestly, it really wouldn't have mattered if it was valued at 1 million Reichsmarks. My grandfather was never getting the money. So at this point, we're at the beginning of 1939 now. I want you to get a sense of the seriousness of the situation and how it's escalating. So we started out, you listened to my father talk about name calling, right? Being called Jew pig in school. Then you have the Nuremberg Laws. So they passed laws restricting the movement of Jews. And then you have Kristallnacht. You have, physical violence and incarceration of Jews throughout Germany. And then you have the stealing and the seizure of their assets. So they have nothing left. And I will tell you that before the Nazis murdered the Jews, they impoverished them. They took everything away from them. Anyway, clearly you can see how the situation is escalating and escalating, and that Germany's not a safe place to be for Jews. And while my grandparents are going through this situation with the jewelry store, the watchmaker shop, arrangements are being made to ship my father out of the country. So my father comes home from school one day in March of 1939. He's 13 years old, and his parents tell him that tomorrow he's going to Paris. He's getting on a train. He's going alone. His parents are not going with him. He didn't speak the language. He did not speak any French. And again, he's 13 years old. Let's listen to my father talk about leaving Germany.
1939, I was taken to the railroad station, and with a group of 100, maybe 200 kids, we took the train for Paris. When we got to Paris, originally, we were sent to the Rothschild hospital because apparently they had enough rooms and beds available to accommodate everybody, and there we were sorted out and sent to various children hostels. I was sent to a place called Chateau de la Guette, which was about 50 miles east of Paris. It was, I don't know whether it was owned by the Rothschilds or whether they had rented it, but we were 136 kids, all from Germany and Austria. We were very well taken care of there. In other words, we had nice accommodations. We were adequately fed.
So think about what this must have been like for him. He's 13 years old. He's going alone to a country where he doesn't speak the language. He doesn't know if he's ever going to see his parents again. I mean, he had to be terrified. And think about what this must have been like for his parents. And you can think about, if you have a 13-year-old or a 13-year-old child or grandchild or sibling, what it would be like to put them on a train to send them out of the country. You're not knowing if you're going to get out of the country, not knowing if you're going to be able to survive. So they too didn't know if they were ever going to see him again. So this had to be incredibly tormenting for my grandparents as well. But spoiler alert, I will tell you that my grandparents did get out of Germany about 2 months after my father. They were able to get out of Germany and they went to England, and they lived in England during the war. So my father, he's at a place called Chateau de la Guette. You can see I have a couple of pictures there, those black and white pictures. Those are my father, pictures of my dad at La Guette. He's 13, 14 years old. The picture on the bottom right is a picture of, I think it was from 1989. So 50 years later, it was a reunion of a lot of the La Guette kids. Most of the La Guette kids survived. I think 10 of them did not. 10 of them, I think, were deported to Auschwitz and they died there. But most of the La Guette kids did survive. What you're looking at on the top left is a class schedule at La Guette. So when he was at La Guette, he had school every day. Half the day was devoted to French. They had to learn French. And half the day was devoted to other subjects. And you can see here down at the bottom, they had 2 hours from 2:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon, activité en plein air, which is outdoor activities, play. They were trying to get these kids into really good physical shape because they did not know what was coming. Down here at the bottom, you can see they had couture, which is sewing, and ménage, which is kind of housework. They were trying to teach these kids life skills. Again, they didn't know what was coming down the pike. I think it was pretty clear they knew that the war was going to start. And again, they were trying to make these kids as self-sufficient as they could. My father spent a few months at La Guette, and then La Guette started filling up. So they took a handful of kids and they sent them to a boarding school nearby. And my father was one of those kids. In May of 1940, about 14 months after my father arrives in France, Germany invades France. And when Germany invaded France, you can see on this map on the right, there's that white line. Mine is kind of covered by the Zoom gallery, but there's a white line, which I think you can see. France, that's the demarcation line. France was divided into 2 zones. North of that line was the area of France that was occupied by Germany. South of that line was the unoccupied area. People are trying to get out of Paris in droves, right? Nobody wants to live under German occupation. This is a picture of a train platform in May of 1940, just showing, you can just see, you can sense the chaos of people trying to get out. My father is at the boarding school at this point. The director of the boarding school didn't think Paris was safe for the kids. And so he owned, like, my father called it an estate down in a town called Poitiers. And he evacuated the school and took all the kids to Poitiers. The problem with Poitiers was that Poitiers is in the still in the occupied portion of zone, so it really wasn't any safer than Paris. So they spent a short time there, and then they returned to Paris. But leaving Paris was hectic and chaotic. Let's listen to my father talk about that train ride to Poitiers.
The director of the school, or the owner of the school, owned an estate near Poitiers, which is sort of halfway between Paris and Bordeaux. When the Germans were basically at the doors of Paris, he decided to evacuate the whole school to Poitiers, and we took the train from Paris to Poitiers. It was quite an experience because everybody was fleeing, and the trains were sort of crowded. I mean, there was barely room to stand, and they were slow, but we finally made it.
So, like I said, so they go to Poitiers, they stay there a short time, and then they go back to Paris. And then Laguette got shut down, and all the kids at Laguette were dispersed to different homes and places around France. My father was sent to a place in La Boule, a facility called Hôtel des Anglais. It was a hotel. And La Boule is in the unoccupied portion of France. Now, it was not easy to cross this demarcation line, right, from occupied France to unoccupied France. The Germans were guarding that demarcation line, and it was not easy. You had to have papers and permits. My father has no idea how they got the papers and permits. He assumes that, he told me he assumed that people were bribed. A lot of people just tried to sneak across the demarcation line, like sneaking across the border. And a lot of people were shot and shot at trying to do that. Not my father and not his group, but people were. Anyway, so they get to La Boule, and it was a really tough winter. It was cold. There wasn't enough food. My father said they were always hungry. Let's listen to my father talk about life that winter in La Boule.
It was a very harsh winter for us. Food was severely rationed, and the things that were not rationed, just like vegetables, just were not available. Then it was very cold and snowy, lots of snow, very cold in winter, and there wasn't enough coal or wood to heat the place. We had minimal heating in the dining room and in the bedroom and in the classrooms. We had zero heat in the bedrooms, and of course we were constantly hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. One of the people we were all 5 or 6 in each bedroom. One of the people in our room was a very tall and strong guy, and I remember he once went during the day, in the evening rather, into the mountains and into one of the barns, and he stole a 50 kilo bag of oats that were kept there to feed the horses. And he brought it back, and we were eating the oats, which were horse meal. And I remember I had a shoebox, and I filled that with oats, and I kept it under my bed.
So horse meal, I mean, they ate horse meal. I mean, you did what you had to do to survive. So my father stayed in La Boule for about 6 months, and then he moved again. I'm not going to take you through every place that he lived in France, but he moved around a lot. All in all, he lived in about 10 different places for the 3 years that he was in France. He moved around a lot. Let me show you what was happening in France while my dad is there and moving around. In May of 1941, about a little over 2 years after he gets there, they start arresting Jews. They start rounding them up and arresting them. And I mean, you could be walking down the street, riding your bicycle, you'd be stopped, asked for your papers, and if you were Jewish, you'd be arrested. About 9 months later, in March of 1942, they started deporting the Jews to Auschwitz. And this is a list of their first 20 deportation convoys. And the first one started the end of March. You can see they all went to Auschwitz, and you can see there were about 1,000 people per convoy. So my father stayed in France until October of 1942, and he's going to escape to Switzerland in October of 1942, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But from May 1941 until October of 42, you know, France isn't a fun place to be for Jews. Jews are being arrested and they're being sent to Auschwitz. So my father was really in hiding, and you don't really get any sense of that listening to him talk. I mean, he's talking about tough conditions and cold weather and not having enough food and, you know, chaotic train rides. He's not talking about being in hiding, but he really was in hiding. I mean, he could not have been found out. And it's probably good that he moved around. The more people moved around, the less chance they had of getting caught. You know, it makes me think of like Anne Frank, who, you know, she was in hiding in one place, and unfortunately, she got found out and caught. By the end of 1942, there's no more demarcation line. There's no more unoccupied France. Germany occupies all of France. And it was decided that France was not safe for any of these Jewish kids anymore. And the decision was made to help these kids escape to Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral. They were not in the war, and they would have been safe there. So my father and 3 friends with counterfeit papers in hand, they get on the train and they take the train to this town called Annemasse. Annemasse is in France, but it's on the border with Switzerland. It's about 7 miles from Geneva, which is, I think, the second largest city in Switzerland. My father said there were controls everywhere, like soldiers on the train kept walking up and down asking for your papers. And when you got to Annemasse, he said you couldn't get out of the train station without showing your papers. They were met at the train station by what my father called a guide. He took them to a safe house. They hid out in the safe house until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then he took them to the Swiss border. There was a little creek. They took off their shoes. They waded across the creek, and they were now in Switzerland. And we're going to listen to my father talk about entering Switzerland, but I want you to think about this train ride to Annemasse and this border crossing into Switzerland. It had to be terrifying. I mean, if they got caught, they'd either be shot or deported to Auschwitz. And you know, a lot of people were trying to escape into Switzerland. The Germans were patrolling that border. So you had to know where to cross and at what time to cross. And you had to understand a bit about the German patrols, because the Germans shot people trying to just cross illegally from France into Switzerland. Okay, so now they're in Switzerland. They start walking and they get picked up by a Swiss border guard. Let's listen to my father talk about this crossing into Switzerland. And keep in mind, there are 4 of them. 3 of them are 16 years old, and 1 of them is 15 years old.
Anyhow, we took off our shoes and socks and pulled up our pants, and we got across the barbed wire and that little river. And on the other hand, we sat down, we put back our shoes and socks, and at that point, that we were already in Switzerland, at the other side of the river was Switzerland. At that point, we were caught by a Swiss border guard. As I said, there were 4 of us. He took us to a sort of entry post where we were asked our names and date of birth. We had nothing on us. In other words, no baggage, I mean, just the clothes that we were wearing. We had zero money, neither French nor Swiss. We had no papers whatsoever. So whatever information we gave them, they had to accept at face value. They asked for our date of birth, and 3 of us were born in 25 or 26, and 1 was born in 1927. And they announced that they would not keep children over the age of 16, and the boss asked one of the border guards to take us back to the border and to ship us back across the border into France. They kept the 4th one, who was born in 1927. He took us back to the border. Turn it off a second. So he took us back to the border and he said, this is France across that little river, and you need to go back. Geneva is in this direction, and I don't know what you're going to do when I'm on my way back. So we waited till he had gotten back, and then we headed towards Geneva.
Wow. So this soldier, I mean, what a decent thing he did. He let these kids enter Switzerland. There were a lot of ordinary people during the war that did a lot of extraordinary things to help people and save innocent people. And we call those people upstanders. And this soldier is just a really perfect example of an upstander he saved the lives of these 3 kids. If they had gone back to France, they had no place to go in France. They definitely would have been, picked up by the Germans and deported to Auschwitz. So they hike into Geneva. They had the name of a pastor and his address, who they knew had helped child refugees. They went to see him. The pastor gave them breakfast. My father said he and his friends, they had no idea that there was that much food anywhere in the world. They really had been hungry in France for a long time. So the pastor fed them. He gave them money for the tram, and he told them to go to the police station and tell the police, you're 15 years old. And even though 3 of them were 16. And that's what they did. They showed up at the police station. They said, we're here. We have nowhere to go. They got sent to a refugee camp. My father actually got assigned to a children's home as a cook, which, if you knew my father, makes absolutely no sense in the world. Anyway, but he's assigned to this children's home. He actually got paid. Half of his salary he would actually get to keep. The other half would go into a bank account. And if he wanted money from that bank account, he had to write a letter to the police and request it. So now he's in Switzerland and he's safe. He's not at risk of being deported, but his life isn't easy because he's not a citizen of Switzerland. He's a refugee. He has a lot of rules he has to live by. He's not allowed to leave the town that he's living in without getting the permission from the police. He's got a curfew. He's not allowed to congregate in groups of, I forget how many, but there was a whole list of about 16 rules and regulations that he had to sign and agree to everywhere he went. And just like in France, he moved around Switzerland a lot. He also lived in about 10 different places in Switzerland, kind of working these odd jobs wherever they needed him. And, people would request him and then they would agree to transfer him. This is a letter from one of the children's homes that my father was at. And they had hired him and brought him in as a cook. And this letter, this paragraph that's exploded talks about, so this is a letter from the children's home back to the police saying, listen, we have this kid, Charles Schwartz. He can't do this job. His nerves are so shot from the experience that he's had. He can't do this job, but he's a nice kid. He's an intelligent kid, and we want to keep him. And we're going to cut his salary to this, but we'd like to keep him. Will you give us permission to do that? And the police said, okay. And the reason I include this letter is it's really the only documentation I have that this was an emotionally difficult experience for my father. You know, you listen to him talk and everything is he's very even tempered and very matter of fact, but clearly, I mean, this was a difficult situation for him. I mean, terrifying. So my father spends about 3 years in Switzerland. Like I said, he lived in a bunch of different places, not because he's in danger, but because he's a refugee and they're moving him around. The war ends in May of 1945. Like I said, he's been in Switzerland about 3 years. I told you earlier, my grandparents escaped from Switzerland and escaped from Germany and then spent the war in England. And so the war ends and you would think my father would go to England to reunite with his parents, but he didn't. He went to Palestine. It was not yet Israel. It didn't become Israel until 1948, but he went to Palestine. He sailed there. He worked on a kibbutz. A kibbutz at the time, if you don't know, was kind of an agricultural commune. And the kibbutz my father lived at and worked on, they grew oranges. And my father was there for about 9 months and absolutely hated it, detested it. He said it was so communist. He said it was like worse than living in Russia. You couldn't own anything. His parents had sent him stamps, airmail stamps, so he could write letters to them. The kibbutz confiscated the stamps because they said, you can't own anything. This belongs to the kibbutz. Anyway, he stayed in Palestine for about 9 months working. And then finally, in 1946, he finally goes to England to reunite with his parents. He's now 20 years old. He hasn't seen his parents in 7 years, since he was 13 years old. He lives with them in England, in their apartment in England. And he stays in England for 2 years. He has to learn English. He didn't speak English when he went there. He had a variety of jobs. And 2 years later, in 1948, he came to America. He said the plan was always to come to America. America was the land of opportunity. The streets here were paved in gold. This was where they always intended to come. So in 1948, he sailed to America. The top right, that's actually the ship manifest from my father when he sailed from Liverpool to New York. He got to Manhattan. He came alone. He did not come with his parents. He came alone. If you know New York City at all, if you know Manhattan, he got an apartment up in Washington Heights. I've seen the building. It's still there. And he got settled. And then a couple of months later, my grandparents came over and they lived in this apartment together. 3 years later, in 1951, he met my mother. They got married 3 months later after they met. And my brother was born almost exactly 9 months after that. I'll let you all do the math on that and see what you think. I was born 3 years after my brother. And now my mother was American. She was born in New York, born and raised in New York. Her family couldn't believe that she was marrying a German. And my father's parents couldn't believe that he was marrying an American. But, you know, everybody ended up, getting along. After the war, my grandparents filed 2 lawsuits for restitution. One was against the German government. The German government, after the war, paid a lot of restitution money to survivors for what they had lost during the war. My grandfather didn't think they were offering him enough money, so he sued them and he won, and he got what he wanted. And my grandparents filed another lawsuit. By the way, and this is a copy of the complaint that they filed. I was able to dig that up. They also filed another lawsuit. My grandparents owned an apartment building in Ludwigshafen that they sold in 1938. They sold it under duress for a lot less money than it was worth. And they sued the couple that bought it from them. And what's interesting, and I don't know how that lawsuit worked out, but what's interesting about it, this couple bought it, and then in 1938 and during the war, Ludwigshafen was bombed pretty badly by the Allies, and this apartment building was destroyed during the war. So by the time my grandparents sued this couple, this building didn't even exist. And I imagine this couple said, well, we don't have this building anymore. And I'm sure my grandparents said, well, we don't care. You basically stole it from us and we want our money. I'm still trying to find out what happened in that lawsuit. And really, the story has a happy ending. My father did great here in America. He built a great life for himself. He built a great life for his family. My father, he had 2 kids. I have 2 kids, and my son and his wife are now pregnant. So, saving my father has now turned into 7 or 8 people. And these are just some pictures of the family. This is my father holding my son as a newborn. These are my kids. I think they were 2 years old there. This is a picture of me getting ready for my bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old. This is a picture of my dad and I. These are my kids. This is at my daughter's law school graduation. And this is at my son's wedding. And so the story has a happy ending. And with that, I will end. I will take questions, but I want to thank you very much for attending this presentation. And I hope you found it interesting.
Thank you, Ron. We appreciate, as always, you sharing your dad's story. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions, so I'll start with this one. Did your dad talk about his experience when you were younger? Did it take a little longer for him to share that with you? What did that look like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. A lot of Holocaust survivors really did not want to talk about their experience. My father had no problems talking about it. He wanted to talk about it. And in fact, he would tell me stories. We used to go on Sundays to my grandparents' apartment. They lived about 40 minutes away, and I would often go with my dad. And I would say to him, Dad, tell me that story again. Tell me that story again as a little kid. And he would tell it. So my father really didn't mind talking about it. There's actually quite a bit. There were, again, like I said, there were some Holocaust survivors that don't want to talk about it. What's more common is Holocaust survivors that wanted to talk about their story and talk about their experiences, but people didn't want to listen. They'd say, you know what, get over it. That was then, this is now. There was really, unfortunately, a lot more of that than the opposite.
Yeah. We have another question. Someone's asking if he retained the different languages that he had learned.
So my mother didn't speak any other languages, and so my parents always spoke to us in English. But then obviously my father spoke French very fluently, and but never really taught it to us. But I did take it in high school and college, and I actually spent a lot of time, and my French actually, I'm not fluent, but it ain't bad for an American. And I did live overseas. I lived in Latin America, and I also speak Spanish. So but it was not really taught by my father.
And I think we have time for 1 more question. Someone would like to know if your father and his family were religious, and if they were, did their faith or Judaism help him kind of get through some of these experiences they had to go through?
Interesting question. So my I think growing up, they were somewhat religious. I think my father, they used to go to synagogue every Saturday. But when I was growing up, by the time I knew my father, he was not religious at all. And still definitely very Jewish. We definitely have a very strong identity of being Jewish. There's no question about that. But for us, it's more cultural. We celebrate the holidays, but the holidays are more about, it's an excuse for the family to get together and eat and drink together. And we say the prayers that you're supposed to pray, that you're supposed to say, but we are not really a spiritual or religious family, but still very Jewish.
Well, Ron, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you again for sharing your father's story. I want to thank everyone who joined us today and for other sessions this week. We'll see you next time. I hope everyone's a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.